And we begin with a Fox urgent. The U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder set to speak out about the findings of two federal investigations in Ferguson, Missouri. The feds say they found a pattern of racial discrimination among officers in Ferguson. They say police in that city used excessive force against black people, much more often than against white people, and that officers also stop and search black people far more often.
Now, as detailed in what I will call our searing report, and it is searing, also released by the Justice Department today, this investigation found a community that was deeply polarized, a community where deep distrust and hostility often characterized interactions between police and area residents, a community where local authorities consistently approached law enforcement not as a means for protecting public safety, but as a way to generate revenue. A community where both policing and municipal court practices were found to be disproportionately harmful to African American residents. A community where this harm frequently appears to stem, at least in part, from racial bias, both implicit and explicit. And a community where all of these conditions, unlawful practices, and constitutional violations have not only severely undermined the public trust, eroded police legitimacy, and made local residents less safe, but created an intensely charged atmosphere where people feel under assault and under siege by those who are charged to serve and to protect them. In a sense, members of the community may not have been responding only to a single isolated confrontation, but also to a pervasive, corrosive, and deeply unfortunate lack of trust, attributable to numerous constitutional violations by their law enforcement officials, including First Amendment abuses, unreasonable searches and seizures, and excessive and dangerous use of force, exacerbated by severely disproportionate use of these tactics against African Americans, and driven by overriding pressure from the city to use law enforcement not as a public service, but as a tool for raising revenue. Now, according to our investigation, this emphasis on revenue generation through policing has fostered unconstitutional practices or practices that contribute to constitutional violations at nearly every level of Ferguson's law enforcement system. Ferguson police officers issued nearly 50% more citations in the last year than they did in 2010, an increase that has not been driven or even accompanied by a rise in crime. As a result of this excessive reliance on ticketing, today the city generates a significant amount of revenue from the enforcement of code provisions. Along with taxes and other revenue streams in 2010, the city collected over $1.3 million in fines and fees collected by the court. For fiscal year 2015, Ferguson's city budget anticipates the revenues to exceed $3 million, more than double the total from just 5 years prior. Our review of the evidence and our conversations with police officers have shown that significant pressure is brought to bear on law enforcement personnel to deliver on these revenue increases. Once the system is primed for maximizing revenue, starting with fines and fine enforcement, the city relies on the police force to serve essentially as a collection agency for the municipal court, rather than as a law enforcement entity focused primarily on maintaining and promoting public safety. And a wide variety of tactics, including disciplinary measures, are used to ensure certain levels of ticketing by individual officers, regardless of public safety needs. Now, as a result, it has become commonplace in Ferguson for officers to charge multiple violations for the same conduct. 3 or 4 charges for a single stop is considered fairly routine. Some officers even compete to see who can issue the largest number of citations during a single stop, a total that in at least one instance rose as high as 14. And we have observed that even minor code violations can sometimes result in multiple arrests, jail time, and payments that exceed the cost of the original ticket many times over. Now, for example, in 2007, one woman received 2 parking tickets that together totaled $152. To date, she has paid $550 in fines and fees to the city of Ferguson. She has been arrested twice for having unpaid tickets, and she has spent 6 days in jail. Yet today, she still inexplicably owes Ferguson $541. And her story is only one of dozens of similar accounts that our investigation uncovered. Now, over time, it's clear that this culture of enforcement actions being disconnected from the public safety needs of the community, and often to the detriment of community residents, has given rise to a disturbing and unconstitutional pattern or practice. Our investigation showed that Ferguson police officers routinely violate the Fourth Amendment in stopping people without reasonable suspicion, arresting them without probable cause, and using unreasonable force against them. According to the police department's own records, its officers frequently infringe on residents' First Amendment rights. They interfere with the right to record police activities, and they make enforcement decisions based on the way individuals express themselves. Now, many of these constitutional violations have become routine. Now, for instance, even though it's illegal for police officers to detain a person, even briefly, without a reasonable suspicion, it's become common practice for officers in Ferguson to stop pedestrians and to request identification for no reason at all. And even in cases where police encounters start off as constitutionally defensible, we found that they frequently and rapidly escalate and end up blatantly and unnecessarily crossing the line. During the summer of 2012, one Ferguson police officer detained a 32-year-old African-American man who had just finished playing basketball at a park. The officer approached the man while he was sitting in his car, and he was resting. The car's windows appeared to be more heavily tinted than Ferguson's code allowed, so the officer did have legitimate grounds to question him. But with no apparent justification, the officer proceeded to accuse the man of being a pedophile. He prohibited the man from using his cell phone and ordered him to get out of his car for a pat-down search, even though he had no reason to suspect that the man was armed. And when the man objected, citing his constitutional rights, the police officer drew his service weapon, pointed it at the man's head, and arrested him on 8 different counts. Now, this arrest caused the man to lose his job. Unfortunately, this event appears to have been anything but an isolated incident. Our investigation showed that members of Ferguson's police force frequently escalate rather than diffuse tensions with the residents that they encounter. And such actions are sometimes accompanied by First Amendment violations, including arresting people for talking back to officers, for recording their public activities, or engaging in other conduct that is constitutionally protected. Now, this behavior not only exacerbates tensions in its own right, it has the effect of stifling community confidence that is absolutely vital for effective policing. And this, in turn, deepens the widespread distrust provoked by the department's other unconstitutional exercises of police power, none of which is more harmful than its pattern of excessive force. Now, among the incidents of excessive force discovered by our comprehensive review, some resulted from stops or arrests that had no legal basis to begin with. Others were punitive or retaliatory in nature. The police department's routine use of tasers was found to be not merely unconstitutional, but abusive and dangerous. Records showed a really disturbing history of using unnecessary force against people with mental illness. And our findings indicated that the overwhelming majority of force, almost 90%, is directed against African Americans. Now, this deeply alarming statistic points to one of the most pernicious aspects of the conduct that our investigation uncovered, that these policing practices disproportionately harm African American residents. In fact, our review of the evidence found no alternative explanation for the disproportionate impact on African American residents other than implicit and explicit racial bias. No other basis. Between October 2012 and October 2014, despite making up only 67% of the population, African Americans accounted for a little over 85% of all traffic stops by the Ferguson Police Department. African Americans were twice as likely as white residents to be searched during a routine traffic stop, even though they were 26% less likely to carry contraband. between October 2012 and July 2014, 35 black individuals. 35 black individuals and 0 white individuals received 5 or more citations at the same time. During the same period, African Americans accounted for fully 85% of the total charges brought by the Ferguson Police Department. African Americans made up over 90% of those charged with a highly discretionary offense described as, and I quote, manner of walking along roadway, unquote. Manner of walking along roadway. And use of dogs by Ferguson police appears to have been exclusively reserved for African Americans. In every case in which Ferguson police records recorded the race of a person bit by a police dog, that person was African American. I know that the overwhelming majority of America's brave men and women in law enforcement, they do their jobs honestly, with integrity, and often at great personal risk. I have immense regard for the vital role that they play in all of America's communities and the sacrifices that they and their families are too often called to make on behalf of their country. It is in great part for their sake and for their safety that we must seek to rebuild trust and foster mutual understanding in Ferguson and in all communities where suspicion has been allowed to fester.
The Attorney General Eric Holder from the Department of Justice before an audience of lawyers with a scathing report on the City of Ferguson, Missouri Police Department, saying, among other things, some of the protesters were not wrong, that among the crimes in Ferguson seemed to be, under the Ferguson Police Department standings, walking while black, and that they sicked dogs on people who were injured 100% in the African American community, no white people. They used the police department as a revenue generator, and in many cases, it appears from listening to the report from the Attorney General, a little more. Our senior judicial analyst, Judge Andrew Napolitano, is with us. Wow, that was intense.
It's intense and it's scathing, and it demonstrates a regular, consistent, and systematic and long-term violation of the rights of the people of Ferguson based on the color of their skin. One wonders with sadness why it took the death of Michael Brown for the feds to recognize this. This is so systemic, so deep, so ingrained in that community. It preceded by many years the death of Mr. Brown. It's regrettable that it took that death to bring this to public attention.
Regrettable at minimum, and the people there will tell you and have told our correspondents and the producers and the rest who have visited, this has been going on for years, and it's not as if the statistics weren't there for the St. Louis County and the state of Missouri to realize the statistics were there and they've been there.
Lest anybody think that this is political from the Obama administration, the Justice Department is required under federal law to enforce the Constitution. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution has been interpreted by the courts to remove race from the decision-making ability of government, federal, state, and local. So when the local police make decisions to prosecute people or to harass them or to shake them down for money, which is basically what the Attorney General is saying happened here, on the basis of race, and when they do this regularly, consistently, and systematically, they have violated the 14th Amendment, they have violated federal laws written to enforce the 14th Amendment, and it is the affirmative obligation of the federal government to enter the scene and correct this.
I wonder if there wouldn't be a series of lawsuits here if I'm one who's felt like I've been, well, they've sicked the dogs on me, or I've been arrested for walking while black. I wonder if I had better find a better call Saul moment, you know, and get some retribution here.
The report does not use proper names in order to keep people's identity from being in the public fray. But obviously there are raw records that lawyers can get their hands on. Who was this lady that the police that the Attorney General was talking about, who the police extracted 3 or 4 times the amount of the fine and arrested her for 6 days because she didn't pay quickly enough? Obviously, she and the others in here have causes of action against the government.